I'm going to start with the 27th gate. Gate of nourishment. 27th gate, very important. 27th gate is one of the role gates. And it's one of the gates we use for understanding profiling. Remember, there are 6 role gates. There are the 4 role gates in the self, in the G center. The 10, the 7, the 1, the 13. And in the sacral center, the 59, the 27. The 27 is the genetic strategy for caring. That's a genetic strategy for caring. That is not an intellectual strategy for caring. And it's about caring for those and those things that can keep one healthy. Caring is not supposed to make you sick. Caring is supposed to be mutually, tribally beneficial. It says above the 27th line, the enhancement of the quality and the substance of all activities through caring. First line. I love this first line. You know, first lines tell you the truth. The inherent truth of the foundation of a hexagram in this first line is selfishness. The first law of caring. Be selfish. Remember something about the nature of all first lines. They are very much involved in trying to figure out what they are and whether what they are has any function and is of any value or even necessary. Think about the 7-1, another one of these role gates. And the 7-1 is called the authoritarian. Now that does not mean that that person, that 7-1 being, is automatically an authoritarian. What they're trying to figure out is, what is an authoritarian? How can I be a boss? How does the boss operate? How does all that work? And is it necessary for me to be authoritarian? So selfishness. The Son exalted the ego-driven first law of caring for oneself, which is not necessarily at the expense of others. And of course, it is the first rule of caring. Care for yourself. And the first thing to recognize about the 27-1 is that they're going to try to figure out what caring for oneself is all about. What do I need to care about? Do I need to care about my diet? Do I need to care about my job? Do I need to care about my lifestyle? Do I need to care about the others in my life? But first, to care about yourself. In the White Book, the power to care for oneself first. The earth in detriment. Now this is a very, as we've been moving along, I have been sharing with you the crosses that originate out of the positions of these gates. And in looking at that, to recognize that profiles are built on Sun-Earth positions. So whenever you see a line that is a Sun-Earth line, the first thing to recognize is that these are special lines that run throughout the 384, and you will discover that there are many of them. What happens, of course, is that these lines themselves automatically become dominant forces in incarnation because they get fixed. So if the Sun is exalted in this line and you have your personality in this line, that cross that you come in on does not include the detriment. But this is a right angle cross. So if the Sun is on the other side in the 28, then the Earth will be in the 27. And then the Earth will dominate in that cross, and envy and its attendant misfortunes will be part of that incarnative field. So these Sun-Earth lines, or wherever the Sun or the Earth is in a line, is an indication that this has a lot of impact in terms of incarnation. The power of selfishness that is manifested through envy. This is about wanting to care for yourself as well as other people do. It is the envy of other people's selfishness. So often the 27-1 in detriment will say, I wish I could be as good to myself as that person is. By the way, nothing wrong with that. When we come to the second line, remember we're dealing with lower trigram. So you're dealing with lower trigram, you're dealing with something that is inherently internal. Please recognize that, because when you're looking at somebody's design and you're working at the analyst level, whenever you're looking at lower trigram lines, it's saying to you, this is their process that they have to work out. And it's important to see that. Whereas if you see upper trigram lines, what you're saying is that's their process that they're going to have to work out with others. Quite different. Whether or not that involves, an electromagnetic connection or whatever the case may be, it's simply the principle of what the lower trigram is all about. So this second line of self-sufficiency, these people automatically care for themselves. Remember what the second line is all about. They automatically care for themselves. They don't want to be bothered by anybody else. They don't want anybody else to particularly care for them. They're running around their house, and somebody on the outside who looks in says, hey, you look sick. Or, hey, could you possibly care for me? But it's not like they're looking to care for anything. They don't even know they're caring for themselves. They're just living their lives. The obvious law that to give one must have. Now, the tribe has only one voice. It's a voice expressed through the 45 that says, I have or I don't have. The tribe is about possession. And ultimately, the tribe is about our material potential in life. One of the things to recognize about the 27-2, and remember, the line itself is an introduction line, so it's telling you that it is a long process in developing this obvious law that to give one must have, that the having comes later. First, one must give to oneself, and then one can share, one can support, in tribal language, one can support others. The moon exalted, the mother, the great nourisher, the strength to nourish and the power to care. But look, that sounds great. But if you're doing somebody's reading and you see that's a second line, you know that that may never come out unless it's called for. This is not, for example, if it's a woman who says, I want to be a nurturing mother. This is about a woman who discovers that she can be a nurturing mother, and is almost surprised by that, because it has to be called out. The same thing with the nurturing father. The male who says, I don't want children, they're not for me, only to discover that they're gaga about having kids. Because it has to be pulled out. One of the things about human design is that one gets to see a lot of things. One gets to see a lot of patterns. And out of those patterns, one can make certain assumptions. However, in order really to be clear about specific aspects in any kind of line, ultimately that's going to take a great deal of research, scientific research, to be able to verify certain things. I give you this preamble because the 27-2 in detriment is something that I've seen in about 75 or 80 AIDS cases. The 27th gate, in terms of the way it's looked by my homeopathic associates, is a place where almost all of our sexual diseases originate, and that is throughout all of those lines. Whether that is syphilis or gonorrhea or herpes, or whether that is mononucleosis, or whether that is AIDS, it's something that we see exists in the 27. Now again, please understand that it is very easy to frighten yourself or others with knowledge that's not substantiated. So I don't want you to take that other than in your own work and in the charts that you get to meet, that it's something to keep in mind if you see that kind of sequence repeated. The 27-2 in detriment is the child depleting the resources of others. Weakness that can sap the strength and power of others. Now look, the 2 is always being called out. It's always being called out. And what happens to it here in the second line is that it gets called out and it's ill-equipped. All second lines can suffer from the paper tiger syndrome. It looks like they can, it smells like a duck and it looks like a duck, but it's not a duck. So what happens to them is, rather than being a source of caring, they begin to absorb and take in caring from others. And they become deeply dependent. This is like the homeless person that's been struggling and rattling around in the urban jungle all by themselves, surviving simply by being what they are and not really having to deal with anything else. And then somebody breaks in and tries to fix all that. It's going to create an enormous dilemma for these beings. They may not be equipped to deal with the so-called way out for them. Second lines can really fall apart under recognition. That's why I mention always second lines in somebody's chart, particularly children, is an indication of where you need to educate them so that they are prepared. The other thing is that because this is coming out of the sacral system, and because it's coming out of our generative system, it has a lot to do with our health, and it's pointed directly at the spleen. How we care is very important. Again, everything about how you enter into any kind of relationship is dictated by the nature of your own design. It's one of the most important experiments that you can make, and that you can start at any point with any stranger that comes into your life, is to make sure that you live out your type, your definition, your authority with them. Then you'll discover what's there for you in that particular relationship. Third line. The instability of the third line through this process of trial and error. I love words. They're extraordinary formulas, tools. And I'm deeply fascinated by human attachment to words and how difficult it is for them to shake away their prejudices that words have and they ingrain within themselves. And greed is one of these words. It's like when you do somebody's 50th hexagram, fourth line, and you say to them, you have the line of corruption. And analysts get squeegee in those moments. Because we have this inherent prejudice against words. We really do. We think that word means something bad, as an example. Anyway, greed. One of my own jokes, because there's always jokes in life. This is the only line that mentions psychiatry or psychology. Of all the 384, right? It's the only line. And it's Freud's line, which I thought was really funny. One day I'm sitting there and the early years of teaching design, we decided to use Freud and Jung as a comparison. And there's Freud with his 27-3. I thought that was great. Anyway, it obviously has a great deal to do with what we now call psychology. That is a way to care, and a way to care that is not necessarily just a physical caring. Remember that the 27 is pointed towards the only true awareness system humanity has. Right? We have these three potential areas of awareness, so-called. The immune system, the splenic system, is the real thing. We've had practice with it. 4 million years, it seems to have done a very good job. It's our existential awareness. There's no bullshit. There's no time to make up stories. It gives you everything in the moment. We know from the nature of authority in human design that the mind, though it may be a delightful awareness, is not an awareness that is directly beneficial to us. That is, it has no authority to be able to direct our lives. And that the solar plex system is still a motor that's operating in a powerful wave system. So anything that is pointed towards the spleen or anything that is coming out of the spleen, this is where there is on earth the only reliable awareness. It's the only consistently reliable awareness. It is our well-being. So when we're looking at the lower trigram, what we're looking at is that we're seeing the inner needs, the inner caring potential, but the caring that has to be inward rather than outward. None of these first 3 lines are really ready to be magnanimous in their sharing. They're not transpersonal. Greed. The obsession with having much more than one needs. I mean, not just more than one needs. Much more than one needs. Okay, so look, these people can be very greedy. They can say, I want more of this, and I want more of that, and I want more of this, and I want more of that. Yeah. Well, okay. What they discover through their greed, what they discover is through that trial and error, they learn about what they can care about being greedy about. Okay. Pluto exalted. Here, the psychological manifestation, the obsession and dependency on knowing what is hidden, the secret policeman. I mean, this is a kind of caring that is very different than the first 2 lines. This is about finding out what is underneath, what is going on, in order to really recognize whether there's anything to care about. It's a way of not caring. I mean, it's a way of not giving of yourself. It's simply a way of probing, in that sense, others, or probing possibilities. Of course, they can be very good at that. That's the kind of person who sits down with you and says to you, what do you need, dear? And then you tell them all the things you need, and they go away. It's not like they necessarily give you anything. You really think they care when they ask you, what do you need? But they don't necessarily give it to you. I mean, that's an internal process. In the White Book, the power derived in having more than one needs, whether sexually, mentally, or materially. If you have a lot, then it's possible to give. The very beginning of this, the very beginning of selfishness, the very beginning of self-sufficiency, all of that is about, hey, look, you got to have enough first. So these people are a way of saying, I gotta get this and this, collect it all. And maybe then they'll give you something, but not for long. The wave is bonds made and broken, and that's what you have. So these are people that will give you something, and then they won't give you any more. Mars and detriment. Mundane and wholly without redeeming value, greed, a lust that inevitably cripples and addicts. And when people get that line, they go, oh, wow. And I always say to them, isn't it true? Isn't it you? Because it's true. And it's okay. And one of the things that really makes these people seem distorted is that they have guilt for that. It's not their fault. I mean, it's not their fault. They're not responsible for their genetic makeup. It's simply what they are. And of course, what happens to them is that they learn the lessons because they go through trial and error. They get punished. They get dealt with. They go through the whole trip. The moment that they understand that that is okay for them to be like that, that it is nothing wrong, there is nothing wrong, it is just a way, then they're healthy. They just are. You know, there are people that hoard and that there are people who give away. This is the nature of the world. You have everything. Every day when I look at the Rave Ephemeris, I look to see who's coming into the world. That's my view. I look to see the position of the sun and the earth, and I look back to the design and I see the beings that are coming into this planet. And I recognize that they carry with them this entire matrix. And I realize that within that entire matrix, you have everything. You're supposed to have everything. It is so important for us, for those people that we deal with, that they recognize that no matter what line they carry, no matter what energy is inherent in their nature, it is absolutely correct if they live it out. Because we need it. We need the greedy ones. We really do. We can't be without them. Just like we need the selfless ones. We need them, and we can't be without them. We cannot be without the polarity. We cannot be enlightened without being endarkened. We can't leave out the polarity. It is not possible. The 27, with the 28, the 41, and the 31, this has been the right angle cross of the unexpected. It's a very interesting cross. The 27, 28, 41, 31. This cross of the unexpected, years ago, somebody had done a calculation for me for the discoveries of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And they all took place with the nodes in either the 27 or the 28, or they took place with the cross itself of the unexpected. So it's an interesting cross. Many unusual things are possible out of this configuration. When you get to the fourth line, you get to the place where we move from lower to upper trigram, so we move to a transpersonal process, and you can see right away how different it is. Look at the foundation of the hexagram, the first line. You've got selfishness, and then look at its harmony, the foundation of the upper trigram, the fourth line, and it says generosity. And you know what these people say? I'm going to care for you whether you like it or not. That's what they say. You know, that's their way of externalizing. They have to externalize caring. Generosity, the natural sharing of attained abundance. Now remember, the lessons of the lower trigram are not lost here. It says the natural sharing of attained abundance. I mean, the abundance has to be there. You know, either you have an abundance of love and you can share that love, or you have an abundance of material resources and you can share those resources, but the abundance must be there. Jupiter exalted, magnanimous and qualitative sharing, the gift of rewarding those who are deserving, or the Mars and detriment, indiscriminate sharing. Now, both of these types, both of these beings, are going to be constantly needing to externalize their caring. I mean, that's what they're here for. And of course, because it's a fourth line, they are opportunistic in their caring. It's very important for them to recognize that they have to wait for the right opportunities where their caring can really be of value. And as a fourth line, they have a missionary, influential potential because they're fixed. You know, they're the ones who are always saying you always have to care, you have to care, you have to care, you have to care, and everybody gets, you get caught up in that. when you get to the juxtaposition cross, you have a changing in the structure. You keep the 27-28, but instead of the 41-31, you get the 19 and the 33. This 4-1 cross, 4-1 profile, is called the juxtaposition cross of caring. And these are the people that are the most fixed on caring. These are the ones that other people often see as something wrong with them. All juxtapositions have a difficult time in life. They have a difficult time because they're neither this nor that. They're a very small minority compared to the rest of the population. And they're extremely fixed in their nature in that they are both upper and lower trigram foundations. So here is the fixed, generous selfishness. You know, this is really deeply fixed on being selfish in caring. I'm going to care for you whether you like it or not. Now, of course, that can be wonderful. It can be an enormous pain in the butt, but that is what it is. When you get to the 5th and 6th lines, you get into the true transpersonal process, and you get into the left angle cross of alignment. Alignment. It is this universalization that establishes what kind of caring is desired by the community. Remember that the 5th line of universalization is always a line upon which society projects. The 1st line tells you the nature of the hexagram, but the 5th line is the way everybody wants to see it. This 5th line is the executor. And the executor being somebody who is a professional at caring, to look after things, to be responsible for them. The executor, the ability to distribute effectively the resources of others. What society wants from caring is not selfishness, I'm only going to care for myself, but what they really want is somebody who's going to care for them and care for their resources. Now remember, the 5th line is the general heretic that has to sit off in the countryside and wait for that moment of crisis when it is called upon to lead, when it's called upon to call others with practical provisions. Jupiter exalted, either the gifted and principal agent of distribution or the good sense and ability to find one. The power and strength to care for the resources of others. Now, these are people that we want to be able to trust professionally. The word trust is the word that lives in this channel of preservation. And of course, there's one thing always to recognize about trust is that it's got a rust in it. Least we forget. Saturn in detriment, a restrictive nature that hampers distribution or the seeking of advice and assistance. Weakness and the risk of loss of power restrict caring. This whole business about abundance, that caring is based on being able to have the resources necessary. So the first thing to recognize about the 27th gate is that the 27th gate is always something that can be weak and operate out of a weak state if it does not have the necessary resources. In other words, if one is physically exhausted, one can no longer properly care for another. So it's very important to see that the 27th gate, that's why it's pointed at the spleen. You know, it's pointed at the health system. It's one of those things when, this cliche about asking people about the nature of life and they ask you, what's the most important thing? And you say health. So health is the first resource that the 27 is looking after. And if it can't look after its own health, it isn't going to be able to look after the health of others. Most important in that is that the executor must be called on to care for others' resources. They cannot initiate that. And whether or not they can care for somebody else's resources is something that is going to be substantiated or legitimized by the sixth line. Remember, we're dealing with two very different things here that you can see in an archetype. The lower trigram is all about me, 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 me. It's all about caring about oneself. And if you don't feel good, hoping that somebody will give you the caring that will be of value to you so you can care for yourself. But the moment it becomes transpersonal, it's all about caring for others, and because this is tribal, it's also about making money from caring for others and about others. This whole business of seeking advice and assistance or being a principled agent of distribution, all of this is material in its nature. So when I see a 27-5, I know that they have a potential in them to be the guardians or the agents of somebody else's resources. In other words, people who can be responsible to look after other people's financial stuff, as an example, or to look after their families, many other things. But remember, when you look at the hexagram and you see it as a house with 2 floors, the second hexagram, we've had this joke of the naked person in the lit room at night and the bands going by looking in. But if you go up to the next floor, to the windows on the next floor, you get to the 5th line. And the 5th line has the window above. And the 5th line never turns on the lights. Never. Because the 5th one knows that somebody could always look in. So the people that are walking down the street, when they look in at the 2nd line, they get to see and they project on that what they see. But when they look up above to the dark window, they can only make it up. They can only wonder what's in there. They can only project on what they think is in there, but they really do not know. And the difference between the 2nd line and the 5th line is the 2nd line has to be educated as to where other people see it, and the 5th line has to be educated as to wait for the right opportunity to show what they can do. That's why 5th lines are exalted in the traditional I Ching. You know, if people project on you that you can do something and then you can do it, everything is rosy. And the 5th line, because the lights are closed, gets to watch the people in the street and not be seen. They see the movie that's going on. They know the game. 6th line. You get to the roof. And when you get to the roof, you get to this classic keynote for 6 lines, eh? Wariness. You know, it's classic. It's exactly, correctly, perfectly the description of what it is to be 6th line. Wary. And that wariness comes out of experience. That's the most important thing to recognize about the 6th line. It comes out of experience. The 6th line in the early part of its life plays out the 3rd line life. It's harmony, trial and error, makes mistakes, gets burnt, and then becomes wary. So when you see the 27-6 and you're doing a reading, don't say you're a caring person. Because it may not be true at all. And you should be a caring person. And it may not be true at all. What you have is somebody that's learned that caring can cause a lot of difficulties. And that it rather not care. It's wary of all that. Protection against an abuse of generosity. And see again, this is an introduction line. You know, if you look, you'll see the selfishness is instantaneous, 1st line. 2nd line is an introduction. 3rd line's an introduction. 4th line. And the 5th line. And the 6th. In other words, there's always going to be this difference. These are all long-term processes. These lines are developmental. So this wariness has to grow. It's not there right away. What's there right away in a 27-6 is the innocent caring. It's just innocent caring. It's the role model. It's wisdom. It's perfect. And then it gets crushed. A protection against abusive generosity that takes place over time. By the way, that generosity is the generosity of caring, of being ready to be the nurturer. Moon exalted. A practical and realistic approach to nurturing whose appropriateness is guided by feelings and instinct. The power and strength to be realistic in one's capacity to care and nurture. And of course, that's their whole thing. They get to a point where the 27-6 looks and says, well, what they're really good at is when somebody comes up to them and says, look, there's this person who wants to look after my this or that or whatever the case may be. You think I can trust them? And the 27-6 says yes or no. And they carry with them in that yes or no a real authority. Because that wariness is that they're always looking at the abuse of generosity. They're always looking at those who give too much and looking at those who take too much. You have a 27-6 child and in a big family, and they know at dinner time who's got more what. They count the peas. They don't say anything. And if one sibling gets more peas more regularly than all the others, then they see an unfairness there in the caring, and they will mark it down in their book, and they will remember it for the rest of their lives. They watch the movie. Pluto and detriment, a tendency to over-suspiciousness, the power of suspicion in limiting the expression of caring. This is the extreme side of being burnt as a caring being. This point of being endlessly suspicious. By the way, it's like people who have the gate of doubt, the 63. And I say to them, doubt, doubt, doubt. Wonderful. Doubt everything. Everything. Until that moment that it's proven to you in a way that you can absolutely accept. Then let go of the doubt. And I would say the same thing to the 27-6 in detriment. Be suspicious as hell, because that's your nature. But it does not mean that you cannot share. It does not mean you cannot care, and it does not mean you will not be cared for. And again, that criteria of what it is to be awake, again, is rooted in your design, not the line. How you relate to the other, how that is going to come out. 27-6s who live out their nature don't meet endless numbers of people that are pointless to be involved with. They don't. When they live out their nature, they discover that their suspicions are not something that turns into a lifetime dense paranoia, but it's simply a valuable tool for assessing who is of value to them. Nothing more, nothing less. The 27th gate of nurturing and caring, this wariness. Once that 27-6 sees that its suspicions are not justified and it's ready to commit itself to caring, where does it go? Where's that next step in our code? It goes to the 24th hexagram. It goes into the Ajna center. It goes into the mind. And it goes into the individual mental process.